Hey, everybody. I'm Mark Amadeo, principal of the Amadeo Law Firm. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar covering the SBA's Women Owned Small Business Program. Now, before we get started, I'll just say a few words about me and my law firm. So, I've been practicing for over 20 years and am the founder of the Amadeo Law Firm. And the firm has locations in DC and in Maryland, and its primary focus is on federal government contracting. So we help clients with all of their government contracting legal needs, and that includes negotiations with teaming partners, post award negotiations with contracting officers, general FAR and DFARS compliance, and helping clients protect their technology in their dealings with the government and their private sector partners. Now, we'll provide you with my contact information at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions on the information that I'm presenting today, feel free to reach out to me after the presentation. So today, we're going to talk about the SBA's Women Owned Small Business or WOSB program. And for a quick roadmap, we're going to cover the eligibility requirements and the certification procedures under the program. But before we get to those, a good place to start is why. For small businesses and owners that decide they want to participate in the program, from time to time, it may be important for owners as they're navigating the SBA rules and procedures to go back to this question and remind themselves why. So, the federal government has stated statutory goals for contracting with small businesses, and that goal is to award 23% of all prime contracts to small businesses. And like I said, that's a statutory goal. And although not a statutory goal, if you look at the scorecard that the SBA publishes, it looks like the government's subcontracting goal for subcontracts to small businesses is around 29%. Now, within the larger goals, the government has sub goals, and one of them is toward 5% of prime contracts and 5% of subcontracts to small women owned businesses. Now, these two sub goals to small women owned businesses are statutory and they're written into federal law. Now, last summer in August, the SBA published its scorecard for fiscal year 2019, and it was a record year for women owned small businesses. $26 billion in prime contracts were awarded to women owned small businesses, and it was only the second time that the 5% goal had been reached. So, in nominal terms, the dollars are not insignificant. It's a $26 billion marketplace. Now, a question for another day, perhaps, is whether 5% is really a high enough goal. So, when you think about it, only 5% of all federal dollars are going to women owned small businesses, and that's in a good year. And when you have a 23% prime contracting goal for all small businesses and a 29% subcontracting goal for small businesses, you have to wonder whether setting a goal of only 5% goes far enough. But again, in nominal terms, it's a $26 billion marketplace. And whatever the contracting goals may be, the SBA's Women Owned Small Business Program is designed to help agencies meet them through set asides and sole source awards that are made under the program. Now, under the SBA's rules, agencies can set aside contracts for women owned small businesses in 92 4-digit NAICS code categories. And it can set aside an additional 21 4-digit NAICS code categories for economically disadvantaged women owned small businesses, which is a subset of women owned small businesses. Now, one thing to note is that economically disadvantaged women owned small businesses can compete for all WOSB set asides, but the reverse is not true. All WOSBs can't compete for EDWOSB set asides. So, first, let's talk about eligibility to participate in the WOSB program. So, a company has to be a business concern, which under the SBA's rules requires the business to be a for-profit business. Now, one thing to note off the bat is that startups are eligible. So there's no requirement that the business be in existence for any period of time. And the business has to be small under its primary classification or NAICS code. Now, it has to be at least 51% unconditionally and directly owned by women who are U.S. citizens, and it has to be at least 51% unconditionally controlled by women who are U.S. citizens. So, in other words, majority ownership and majority control has to be unconditionally in the hands of women who are U.S. citizens. And for purposes of being eligible for set asides and sole source awards that are targeted to economically disadvantaged women owned businesses, um, majority ownership and majority control has to be in the hands of women who are economically disadvantaged. And we'll touch on that more in a few minutes. So, we talked about unconditional majority control and ownership. And before we get into the specifics, I just want to go over what this means in general terms. So, under the SBA's rules, whether it's a WOSB program or the SDVOSB program or the Hub Zone program, unconditional ownership and control is exactly what it sounds like and nothing less. It means that there can be no strings attached to ownership. So, a qualifying owner has to be able to do whatever she wants, whenever she wants, with her ownership interests and benefits. And the qualifying owner, and only the qualifying owner, has ultimate and unquestioned control of the company. Now, the SBA's rules, and when it comes to applying the SBA rules, the SBA's Office of Hearing and Appeals, they're both strict and unforgiving. And this is something that all owners of a business and their respective consultants and advisors have to come to terms with. And they need to wrap their heads around this as early as possible. So, for a 49% non qualifying owner or non qualifying minority owners who have invested time and energy and resources into getting a business started, well, it may be hard to grasp that the 51% qualifying owner has to, at all times, maintain unconditional control. So, WOSBs and STVOSBs and hub zones, they're not typical corporate entities where ultimate responsibility may rest on a board or where some important decisions are made by committee. And it's important for everyone, including all the owners, to understand this and to understand what it is they're buying into, particularly at the early startup and formation stage, because it will save headaches down the road. Now, and that's where getting back to that's where it's important to get back to the question why, which we talked about a few minutes ago. So owners have to remind themselves as they work through these issues. Do they want to own a WOSB or EDWOSB? And do they want to participate in that $26 billion market that we talked about? So the 51% ownership by the qualifying owner has to be direct and unconditional. So direct means that there can be no layers that separate the women owner from the business that she owns. So, for example, the ownership shares can't be owned by another business that she then has an ownership interest in. And unconditional means just that. Her ownership can't be subject to any conditions or any other agreements that would cause her ownership benefits to go to someone else. So, what does this mean? Well, for agreements that give rights of first refusal to other owners and that may require the qualifying owner to give up her right to sell her interest to whoever she wants, well, those agreements may be problematic. Same thing with waterfall agreements that may direct the proceeds from the sale of the qualifying owner's shares to other owners. Now, these may be problematic because they place conditions on the economic benefits that she's entitled to receive as a member or shareholder. So we said that 51% or majority ownership has to be direct and it has to be unconditional. And we just touched on what those terms mean. But what is 51% ownership? What does that mean? Well, the SBA rules spell out what this means in different contexts. For partnerships, it means ownership of at least 51% of each partnership class. And for LLCs, it means at least 51% of each class of member interest. And for corporations, it means at least 51% of each class of voting stock and 51% of all outstanding stock. So if I had to guess, I would say that unconditional control is where would-be WOSBs and EDWOSBs that don't qualify most often fall by the wayside, particularly startups. And again, ultimate control has to rest with the qualifying owner, regardless of how much effort or energy or resources that non qualifying owners have put into starting and running the business. And ownership agreements have to reflect this. Now, as to the kind of control that the qualifying owner has to have over the business, there are two kinds of control. There's control over how the business is managed, and that includes control over other managers. And then there's control over the daily operations and how that business actually operates. And the SBA regulations say this means that both long term decisions and management of day to day operations have to be conducted by qualifying women owners. So, what does this mean? Well, first, any restrictions that could interfere with the qualifying owner having ultimate decision making control are going to be problematic. So, for example, provisions that require a supermajority of voting shares for a business decision to be made. Well, to the extent that a supermajority requirement now impedes a qualifying owner from having ultimate decisional authority, well, those provisions may be problematic. And even simple majority rules that require a majority of owners or members present at a meeting to make certain important or impactful or long term decisions are going to be problematic because the SBA rules don't carve out important or impactful or long term decisions. On the contrary, as I said, the SBA rules say explicitly that qualifying owners have to have ultimate decision making over long term decisions. So, in order for a qualifying owner to be able to exercise the kind of control that the SBA thinks she should have, the SBA rules implicitly make certain assumptions and they impose certain requirements based on those assumptions. So, first, the rules require that the qualifying owner have the highest position in the company. And the assumption is that if someone else that is not a qualifying owner has a higher position, well, then he or she actually has ultimate control over company decisions. Second, the rules require a qualifying owner to have the kind of management experience that's required to run the business. Now, that doesn't mean that she has to hold all licenses or have all the technical expertise, as long as she has ultimate management and supervisory control over those that do. And third, and this is what can trip up certification for startups, the SBA rules assume that to be actually managed on a day to day basis, a business has to have a full time manager. And so, under the SBA's regulations, the qualifying owner with the highest position in the business has to manage it full time and during normal business hours. So she can't have outside employment if it prevents her from devoting time and attention that's needed to control the daily operations of the business. So, like with unconditional ownership, the SBA's rules spell out how management control applies in the different forms that a company can take. So, for partnerships, the qualifying woman owner must serve as a general partner. For LLCs, she must be a managing member with control over all of the company's decisions. And all is highlighted there because that's exactly what the regulations say. And for corporations, she must control the board of directors by either having at least 51% of the voting stock while being on the board, or having enough voting shares to overcome any supermajority, or if not with voting shares, then women owners have to control the board through their numbers. So, men and other businesses entities can be involved in management and they can be owners within the limits of the majority ownership. They just can't exercise control or have power to control the business. Now, we mentioned licenses a few minutes ago and said the SBA rules say that the qualifying owner doesn't necessarily have to hold licenses. But the SBA rules do warn that if a man has a required license and an equity interest in the company, well, he may be found to control the business. So, before we move on to certifications, I just want to talk briefly about economically disadvantaged women owned small businesses or EDWOSBs. So, we said earlier that for EDWOSBs, unconditional majority ownership and control must be by economically disadvantaged women owners. Now, the SBA rules assume that economic disadvantage or impairment will occur only when certain conditions are present. So the first is with regard to the owner's personal net worth. It must be less than $750,000. Now that doesn't include the value of a primary residence. The second, the adjusted gross income that's averaged over 3 years can't exceed $350,000. And third, the fair market value of all of our assets must be less than $6 million. Now, for this value, we are including uh, the primary residence and the value of the business, but we're not including IRAs or other retirement accounts. Now, the SBA rules say that the SBA may consider a spouse's financial information to determine the qualifying owner's access to capital and credit, but it will definitely consider the SBA's financial situation if the spouse um, has a role in the business or lends or guarantees a loan to the company. So let's talk about certification. Now, if a business can meet the eligibility requirements for ownership and control, should it pursue certification? Now, I think for a lot of businesses, the answer is it depends, particularly now that companies can no longer just self certify their status on a contract by contract basis. Now, on the one hand, certification opens the door to WOSB and EDWOSB set asides and sole source opportunities under the WOSB program. But as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, under the SBA's regulations, contracting officers can only set aside and sole source contracts for WOSB and EDWSBs in certain industries. And in particular, in industries that the SBA has determined that women owned businesses are underrepresented or substantially underrepresented. So, WOSB and EDWOSB set asides and sole source contracts are not available for all NAICS codes. So, the first step that a small business should take if it thinks it maybe qualify as a WOSB and EDWOSB is to determine if there can even be set asides or sole source opportunities in its primary NAICS code. And a small business can find this out by looking at the list of NAICS codes that the SBA has compiled that are eligible for WOSB and sole source contracts. And this is a list that the SBA examines every 5 years. Now, this is especially important for companies that think they may want EDWOSB certification because the information that they're going to have to provide to demonstrate economic disadvantage is more detailed and involved. Now, if a company isn't looking for set asides or sole source awards under the WOSB program, if there's some kind of agency goal or subcontracting plan that includes subcontracts to WOSBs, then it doesn't need the WOSB certification and the business can just self certify. So, companies that want to be certified have to be registered in SAM, and they face two options when they start the certification process. They can get certified by the SBA itself, or they can get certified by third party certifiers. Now, certification by the SBA is free, and applicants apply through the SBA's beta.certified.sba.gov website. Now, the SBA has loads of information at that website, and there's a knowledge base, and there's several checklists and videos to help owners with the application. Now, the other option is for owners to get certified by a third party certifier, and these third party certifiers can charge a fee. Now, currently, there are four approved third party certifiers, and the prices for, for certification generally start at between $350 and $400. And there may be some discounts or bundled fees if a company uses other services or is a member of the certifying organization. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that any certification by a third party certifier will still have to be uploaded by the company into the SBA's beta.certified.sba.gov website. So, in other words, the company will still have to complete its WOSB certification with the SBA. Now, companies that use the SBA process to get certified have been permitted to use certain existing certifications to prove their eligibility. So, a business can submit evidence of SDVOSB and VOB certification by the VA, along with evidence that it's owned and controlled by one or more women or one or more economically disadvantaged women, in order to prove eligibility. A business can also use 8A certification along with evidence that it's owned and controlled by one or more women in order to prove that it's an EDWOSB. So, a few words about the SBA's certification timelines. Now, when the SBA receives an application, it will screen it within 15 days to see if the application is complete or incomplete. And if it's not complete, the SBA typically will issue an RFI or a request for information for any additional documents that may be missing. Now, once an application is complete, the SBA will turn around a decision on certification within 90 days. Now, if the SBA declines to certify a company, the company can reapply after 90 days if it believes it's cured any deficiencies. And same goes if a company has been declined by a third party certifier, it can reapply after 90 days. Now, on the issue of delays and requests for information, this certification requirement only became effective last summer. But with some experience under its belt, the SBA has said that a common reason for delays and requests for information are non matching numbers. So the SBA pulls information about a company from its SAM profile. But if the DUNS numbers or the tax ID numbers or the SAM NPIN that the company enters in its WOSB application don't match what's in SAM, well, that's going to lead to delays. Now, also, a woman owner should be listed in SAM as the point of contact because, again, the SBA is going to pull that information and list that person as the point of contact for the WOSB application. And lastly, the SBA has found that applications are getting hung up in the system because applicants are not completing their applications. So they've not submitted their attestations or the e signatures in order to complete their submission. Now, the last point I want to touch on is on maintaining certification. WOSBs have to represent to the SBA every year that they remain eligible for the program, and they have to be recertified every 3 years. Well, that's all I have for my presentation today. I want to thank everyone for listening. And if you have any questions about the presentation, my information is up there on the slide, so please don't hesitate to contact me.